Hello, everyone. My name is John True, and I'm the Global Head of Skills and Opportunities for Youth Employment and Entrepreneurship at Plan International. And I'm based in Bangkok, Thailand.
And I'm Bella Angela Del Rio, the Yes Team's Youth Consultant for Communications and Advocacy at Plan International based in Manila, Philippines.
So welcome, everyone, to Unit 3, our crash course on meaningful youth engagement and youth employment. For this unit, we're going to focus on the concept of youth economic empowerment and how that relates especially against the backdrop of the COVID virus pandemic.
Now, we already gave you a little introduction to this concept in Module 1. So here, we're going to dive a little deeper and explore challenges, opportunities, and solutions around youth economic empowerment.
Bella, before we proceed though, can you remind us about the learning objectives of this session?
Sure. By the end of the session, all learners are expected to be able to recognize the drivers and root causes of youth unemployment and economic precarity, especially the gender dimensions of youth and underemployment. Define youth economic empowerment, articulate the key trends affecting youth labor market opportunities against the backdrop of the COVID-19 pandemic, understand emerging promising practices and innovations in YE with relevance to the region, and apply learning about MYE and its central importance to effective YE approaches.
Let's start with an overview of the situation facing young people in Asia and the Pacific labor market, even before the onset of COVID-19.
So we first need to say that even before the outbreak, there were major challenges that young people needed to overcome to attain quality jobs and livelihoods.
So, COVID-19 across Asia and the Pacific, young people were much more likely to be unemployed than adults, from 3 times more likely in East Asia to 6 times across Southeast Asia and the Pacific, and in Southern Asia. The regional youth unemployment rate in 2019 was nearly 14%, compared to 3% for adults. Astonishingly, 24% of young people in the region were not in education, employment, or training. In the development sector, we refer to this group as NEETs, N-E-E-T. NEET rates in Asia and the Pacific have been rising since 2012.
Perhaps even more concerning is that for young people who do have jobs, 84% of them work in the informal sector, meaning that they lack social and legal protection and any kind of job security compared to 69% of adults. The high incidence of individuals working in informal jobs means this is a challenge endemic to the labor market.
Added to that, 1 in 4 young people live and work in conditions of extreme or moderate poverty, meaning they earn below $3.20 a day, compared with 18% of adults. These statistics together paint an alarming picture that whilst youth unemployment remains a big challenge, it is the poor quality of jobs that young people currently contend with the most.
And then, of course, when looking at these numbers, we need to think about how women are disproportionately affected. For example, nearly 3/4 of NEETs in the region are young women.
Okay, so with this very bleak picture painted, and again, bearing in mind these numbers are even before the pandemic, what exactly are the causes for these disparities?
High levels of precarity for young people are caused by multiple constraints on both the supply side and demand side of the labor market. Supply side constraints refer to barriers faced by youth that prevent them from attaining key labor market information, skills, and experience.
And demand side constraints refer to the lack of accessible quality jobs, which relates to the larger economic trends and business environment. Economic and social policies and regulations, which together create conditions for low job creation and poor protection for workers.
Supply and demand side labor constraints are also affected by multiple intersecting socio-cultural factors that greatly constrain vulnerable young people. These can be related to the urban or rural divide, cross-border migration, disabilities, gender identity, sexual orientation, ethnic minority status, and other forms of discrimination.
These different factors create particularly vulnerable populations who then face immense barriers to access quality jobs and livelihoods and improve their socioeconomic situation.
An example of this is how entrenched gender stereotypes play a significant role in holding young women back from fulfilling their socioeconomic potential, specifically throughout the region. Women are seen as caregivers and as having a duty to stay home, marry, and have children early. This results in women not being able to continue their education or access training and likely end up stuck in low skilled, informal, and precarious work, whilst also still burdened with unpaid household responsibilities.
A lot of these supply and demand constraints also exist for adults. But what makes it particularly difficult to find quality and stable employment as a young person? Let's address this in the next slide.
Besides all the various economic factors we've discussed, it's important to understand that youth economic empowerment is also underpinned by social, political, and cultural issues linked to youth's aspirations, parents' perceptions, and expectations and community values.
The period between 15 and 30 is full of vital transitions and transformations of young people. This is the time when you link critical points of transition from human capital accumulation, readiness for work, and eventual integration into the labor market.
These critical junctions mean that there are dynamic pathways between learning and earning. For example, some young people find ways to balance continuing education or training and working at the same time, or creating their opportunities for generating income through self employment and entrepreneurship.
Young people are typically harder hit than adults by economic shocks. And during COVID 19, the demand side impacts caused by business slowdown and economic recession are compounded for young people by supply side disruptions to education and training.
Young people, of course, also face significant power imbalances and disadvantages compared to adults in the labor market. Without the established social capital of experience and the overwhelming competition to get into entry level positions, means that youth often have to resort to the informal sector for employment.
So, having addressed the various socio-cultural and economic constraints that young people have to overcome, we can now get a better understanding of why youth economic empowerment is so important. Let's be clear. When defining youth economic empowerment, we mean young people having the means to achieve independence and control, or what we often refer to as agency, over their own financial resources and therefore greater decision making over their lives. And this is how we define economic empowerment.
As we mentioned at the beginning, existing challenges that young people in the labor market faced have been exacerbated on an unprecedented scale since the beginning of the global pandemic.
And we have seen from past crises, young people are usually hit much harder than adults by economic shocks, as those crucial transitions they are going through are disrupted significantly. Opportunities are fewer and jobs are more likely to go to adults who have established work experiences and social and economic capital.
Based on the data that has so far been collected, we can see that unemployment rates are rising faster for youth than adults, that young workers have lost a greater number of working hours, and that half of all employed young people in the region are working in the hardest hit sectors.
From this, it can be seen that labor markets almost see young people as expendable compared to adults. And with such fragility inherent in markets, young people will naturally be hit much harder. COVID 19 is also affecting the major labor market trends we mentioned earlier, such as digitalization, migration, and urbanization.
For example, the impact of the pandemic has revealed a degree of resiliency in many youth, as digitalization has become central to maintaining a livelihood during this crisis. And digitalization has actually rapidly increased as a result.
And this is what we mean when we talk about the new normal. These adaptations we have to make to cope with a new reality. Digitization of the job market is a trend that will not go away and is crucial for skills training to go ahead of the market and prepare young people for these major challenges.
So, after discussing all the challenges, let's move on to something more positive, the solutions.
As we mentioned, when we talk about youth economic empowerment, we need to look at both the supply and the demand side factors. We do this by designing solutions that are integrated, targeted, and gender transformative to really tackle the root causes of youth and underemployment in the region. What do we mean by these concepts?
So, let's go over a few of the concepts in more detail that are really crucial when designing these YEE solutions. The first is having an integrated approach. This means that youth employment solutions not only address both supply and demand issues, but also take into account other issues such as gender, climate change, social norms, and discrimination. Thinking broadly beyond economic terms and linking different issues together helps to design solutions that are more sustainable and inclusive. The current pandemic really serves to highlight the importance of forward thinking and making sure that solutions are as dynamic as such drastic changes to markets and society.
We also talk about solutions being targeted, which means trying to have a positive impact on young people, with young people, for young people. We always aim to reach and engage the most marginalized and vulnerable youth populations, those who have been left behind by education and training systems, or face discrimination and injustice in the labor market. This also means advocating for improved national curriculum and education infrastructure and making sure they are more closely linked to labor markets.
This also relates to gender transformative, which describes our ambition to achieve gender equality, to overcome the ways of thinking in society that hold women back from achieving their potential. Youth economic empowerment solutions must be designed in a way that empowers women economically to access the same opportunities as men.
And finally, inclusivity, where we are meaningfully engaging all youth, regardless of their background or identity, in the actual design of these programs so that they have a say in how their futures are determined. Finally, it's useful to remember our lesson from Module 1 that highlights the 5 emerging promising practices within youth economic empowerment.
Yes, I remember the YE solutions. Deliver sustainable employment outcomes, considers interconnected social, cultural, political, and personal dimensions, integrates supply and demand side labor market features, builds connected education and labor market systems across key stakeholders, and engages young people throughout the project cycle.
Youth economic empowerment has many facets and can't be seen in isolation. Yes, with the COVID-19 response and recovery, the policies and programs should also adapt to support youth economic empowerment solutions where specific impacts on young people's employability and employment are considered to enable young people to play their part in contributing to the recovery of economies and local labor markets. Let us look next at an example of an innovative youth economic empowerment solution to give you some idea of what that might look like.
From our own portfolio of work at Plan International, we have the project Wired for Work being carried out in Indonesia and the Philippines until 2021, and reaching up to 35,000 young people. The project works across the retail sector, hospitality, automotive, and electronics industries. So the demand side is handled by private sector engagement. This means creating agreements with businesses and companies to create more job opportunities for young women and marginalized youth. Working with other private sector actors to develop more market relevant training curricula that are also digitally accessible. The digital element also allows organizations to carry out market scans, which means analyzing the job market to see which jobs and skills are in high demand and low supply. This helps both job seekers and employers alike.
On the supply side, the project develops and scales up vocational training modules that can be accessed online. This allows greater accessibility for youth who otherwise face barriers to accessing skills development courses, either due to cost, geographic distance, discrimination, or other factors. Following skills development, the project then also facilitates job placement of those young people through its agreements with local businesses.
As you mentioned before in this module, building an enabling environment for young women as well as promoting decent work is also crucial to youth economic empowerment. To this end, the Wired for Work project builds alliances with other key organizations and networks to advocate for improved policies on working conditions and inclusion of young women in the labor force.
The project has also seen the development of the Youth Employment Solutions digital ecosystem, plans Digital Youth Employment Solutions flagship technology, a digital ecosystem where projects can utilize the labor market scan, conducting, monitoring, and evaluating as they grow and develop their vocational training modules.
Now, let's take a look at how meaningful youth engagement and youth economic empowerment can be brought together.
Let's deep dive into the importance of meaningful youth engagement for youth economic empowerment. The best way to ensure that a solution is relevant and has genuine and lasting impact is to not only closely involve those who will be affected, but to actually have them lead that process and be empowered with decision-making roles.
By doing this, YEE solutions become more credible, effective, and appropriate for each context. It also guarantees inclusivity of those who will benefit, especially the most vulnerable, because they have been directly involved in the development of the program from the beginning. It also allows for cross-generational collaboration and trust building between youth and adults based on the principle of mutual respect.
As the International Labor Organization has stated, young people must be included and represented in the tripartite dialogue structure, which the ILO uses to advance workers' rights and interests at the policymaking level. The ILO tripartite model brings workers together with governments and private sector to negotiate the realization of positive working environments for workers. Meaningful youth engagement essentially brings young people into the same room and gives them a decision-making role in that dialogue.
A recent and COVID-19 related example of how youth have been meaningfully engaged on a youth employment intervention comes from Vietnam, a country which has received international praise for their COVID response and mitigation strategy.
In April 2020, a coalition of youth organizations in Hanoi, including the Ho Chi Minh Communist Youth Union, the Hanoi Student Association, and the Hanoi Youth Federation, among others, launched a campaign to offer 10,000 jobs to students and youth who had lost their jobs during the pandemic.
The project aims to equip those youth with seasonal based work and work from home jobs, as well as employment for when the pandemic ends.
Those same youth organizations have been running workshops in collaboration with private sector actors and universities for job counseling and job matching services.
What is really remarkable about this kind of project is the proactivity of those youth organizations and this campaign being initiated and designed by young people themselves. They saw their community suffering under the pandemic and organized themselves to take action.
Exactly. And this kind of action and empowerment of youth is possible when supportive structures exist and youth are recognized for their value and have the opportunity to positively impact the lives of young people, their families, and their communities.
So, to recap this module, We've talked about the social and economic precarity of young people in the job market, the main causes of young people and underemployment from both the supply and demand side labor market constraints. Some examples include a lack of relevant skills, quality jobs, and labor market information.
We also discussed the concept of youth as a period of transition and the major changes that young people go through between the ages of 15 and 30, mainly in terms of transitioning from education to employment, embracing their own unique sense of identity, and the ways in which power imbalances with adults constrain their smooth entry into the labor market. We also touched upon the ways in which economic shocks, such as COVID-19, have amplified impacts on youth during these critical years.
We then expanded on the disproportionate impact of the pandemic on youth on and underemployment, with many more young people losing their jobs than adults, and the impact on changing labor market trends, including migration, digitalization, and urbanization.
Next, we moved on from the challenges to the solutions, and went into quite some detail about different concepts. But the most important takeaways are that youth economic empowerment solutions need to be integrated, targeted, and gender transformative.
To demonstrate such a program, we showcased the Wired for Work project being carried out in the Philippines and Indonesia, which is utilizing digital technology to improve the access to quality skills training curriculums to young women and vulnerable youth, as well as align skills training with demands in the market. The project also works to influence companies and businesses to be more inclusive of youth in their job creation and create an enabling environment for young people's access to decent work. And finally, we gave an example of how meaningful youth engagement benefits youth economic empowerment with an example from Vietnam, where several organizations were able to organize and collaborate together with businesses to match young people out of work due to the pandemic to 10,000 jobs. This was a great example of how youth can become leaders and proactively seek economic empowerment solutions for young people, including the most vulnerable during a crisis.
That's all for today. We hope you've learned new information and feel more confident to play your part in creating quality jobs with and for young people where you are, especially as the policy world for youth employment can sometimes be full of jargon. This was also a lot of information to take in, so make sure to revisit this module and take the time to look at the suggested readings if you want to get more information and become more comfortable with the material. See you in Module 4.